In September 1942, our platoon took up positions in front of a small height in the center of the division's defense and conducted surveillance of enemy positions. We scouts had to know what was going on in the enemy trenches. Whether there were not changed units there, whether fresh forces approached them, and whether the enemy is not up to something. We had long ago learned to understand the enemy by sounds and could almost unmistakably determine that, for example today, at the big pillbox stands red-haired German, and on the flanks bespectacled or Dilda. We gave such peculiar nicknames to all the Germans we were watching. The nicknames helped us to remember their character and behavior. We knew that Dilda does not like the darkness and is on duty without letting go of his rocket launcher, but bespectacled works very nicely on a handheld machine gun. By the way, I myself immediately learned this art, and sometimes entered into an unspoken duel with the German. When two machine guns began to work, all other shots stopped. Both Germans and Soviet soldiers watched who would play this or that motif better, more beautifully. Now it is strange to remember about it, but such things happened in our trench life. One night, having taken the usual post in front of the height, we suddenly found that there were some changes. All that we had heard on the height up to now was gone, and quite different sounds appeared. This meant that another part of the enemy had come there, and we were in all probability to take a prisoner again. We immediately reported the changes in the Germans' defenses to the regimental commander, but contrary to expectation, we were not sent for a prisoner, but were ordered to continue our observation. Soon we learned that the Germans had replaced their troops in the entire defense of our division, and we realized that they would certainly try to take our town. From personal experience, I knew that the Germans almost never conduct night searches with small forces, and tried to capture a prisoner during combat reconnaissance, throwing in relatively large units. However, such attempts ended sadly for the Nazis. They went away, and instead of the language carried away a decent number of their dead and wounded. As far as I remember, during the whole war the Germans did not manage to take a single prisoner from the trenches of our division. The battle reconnaissance in September 1942 also cost the Germans dearly. On that memorable day, for some reason, we stayed longer than usual in the trenches and went behind the front line when it was already quite dark. When we got closer to the height, we noticed that a passage was made in the wire fence. This meant that the Germans would come to the neutral strip for some purpose. Then we thought they would mine, so we moved aside and waited for further events. Half an hour passed. And then the Germans came out of the trench. And there were a lot of them, about a battalion. But strangely, all of them were armed with machine guns and hung with grenades, and some of them had handheld machine guns. So, the Germans are not going to work, and they go to our defenses. This is the battle reconnaissance. My first thought was to inform my men immediately. But then I come to the conclusion that until dawn the Germans will probably not act, and during this time we will have time not only to warn the command, but also to think up how to teach the Krauts a better lesson. We continue to watch and see that the battalion is moving in a chain to our stronghold to the right of the height. But why did they move so brazenly where there were our minefields? In all probability, the sappers had been here last night and made passages. But where these passages are, whether the Germans will come close to our positions. They answered both of these questions themselves. The Germans marked the passages on the minefield with large stones, and they lay low and quieted down. Our defense could neither see nor hear them. I immediately sent 2 scouts to report the situation to the regiment commander, and he took measures. They sent us reinforcements, a whole company. And my guys returned with 2 squads of machine gunners and the order to cut off the enemy escape routes, and until then sit quietly, so as not to scare the Nazis. We carefully dug in and lay low. There was a good hour before dawn, when the sky behind the line of our defenses lit up and a strong blow split the air. Where the Germans lay, powerful bursts of mines and shells rose up. From our side several machine guns hit them simultaneously. From the rockets fired by mortars and hung in the sky on parachutes, it became as bright as daylight. and the Germans were stunned and pinned to the ground. The density of fire was so great that death overtook both those who were lying down and those who jumped up from their places and tried to escape. The fire attack ended with a salvo of the Division Katyusha Guards rocket mortars. Our group did not even have to cut off the enemy's way of retreat, as was ordered, for the simple reason that there was no one to retreat. The Nazis remained where they had laid low for their morning attack. German batteries opened return fire on our defense and conducted it for at least 2 hours, but it was too late. The Nazi battalion had already been destroyed. And we, having taken shelter the whole day spent on a neutral strip, in order to survey the battlefield by evening and pick up wounded Germans, if any. At dusk we set out. A terrible picture presented itself. Some of the Nazis were so mutilated that it was getting creepy. Clothes on many soldiers almost completely burned. It smelled of burned meat, and the odor was disgusting. We carried into our trenches about a dozen severely wounded Germans, including an Oberleutnant who refused to speak at all. The destruction of the Nazi battalion was a major success for the regiment, and everyone's spirits were high. And our soldiers composed ditties on this occasion, ditties, and sang them to the accordion and guitar. There were a lot of ditties, and they, one more cheerful than the other, had such a noisy success that the soldiers repeated the concert especially for the personnel of the headquarters. The next morning the regimental commander invited me to go to the infirmary, to the wounded Germans, to interrogate the prisoners. The Oberleutnant again categorically refused to report anything, and we went to another, large-bodied German, in the rank of Ephraitor. He had been wounded in both legs and in the back, but he held himself upright. I started the conversation with a joke, telling the Nazi that he starts his career, like Hitler himself, as a sergeant. "My Führer is God," the German replied. Then he began to pester me with questions: what would happen to him, whether he would be shot or buried alive, whether his legs would be saved. But my answers came to the perfection of the lieutenant, and he willingly named the numbers of units, the names of commanders, not forgetting to say which of them is a Nazi, showed on the map the location of batteries, bunkers and machine gun nests on the front line of defense. Before we left, we wished the Ephraitor a speedy recovery. In response, he smiled in surprise and confusion. Passing by the ward where the Oberleutnant was lying, I heard that the German was talking to a nurse. It turned out that this girl was from a Jewish family and had a good command of the German language. Listening, I realized the officer was surprised to see a woman wearing a military uniform. "Fighting," he said, "is not a woman's business. Girls should have a good heart, and in war people become rude." "Russian girls are kind," replied the nurse, "and that is why they are at war." "If kind," said the Oberleutnant, "then cover me with your overcoat, I am cold." The nurse shuddered, adjusted the overcoat on her shoulders and left the room. Returning from the infirmary, we stopped by the division headquarters. The lieutenant colonel went to the general, and I visited my acquaintances from the reconnaissance company. In their dugout I boasted that our regiment had killed a whole battalion of fascists without a single loss. And the guys, in turn, reported in confidence that we are not simple either, that their company is preparing for a big raid on the enemy's rear. But that's another story.